The auction sat in the bowels of a broken mining town, tucked into a canyon that forgot what light felt like. A bleached banner, hand-painted, frayed, fluttered above the half-erected scaffold that served as a stage. They called it a livestock sale, but everyone knew it was for the condemned. Horses too maimed to ride, tools rusted past repair, and human beings dragged from war trails and borderland raids put on display like livestock indeed. Jonah Delvin arrived an hour before the gavel dropped, his boots blackened with dried manure from the ride, and his hat pulled low to avoid catching eyes. He'd spoken maybe a dozen words in the last year. None today. He kept to the shadows near the whiskey tent, watching the men roll in panners, scouts, officers gone bad, the desperate and the cruel. He wasn't here for cattle or company. He was here because a man named Otis Finch had written him a letter with one line only. They got one with blue paint on her face, still breathing. Jonah knew what that meant. Comanche war girls painted their faces before riding into battle, before killing or dying. Blue meant she had killed before, maybe would again. She was the last one to be let out. They kept her in irons, the chain looped twice around her throat and cinched tight behind her back. Her hair was a wild nest, matted with leaves and blood. She walked stiffly, barefoot, a limp in her left leg. Her face, young, no older than 15, was smeared with dried war paint, faded from blue to bruise. She did not look down. She did not cry. Her gaze stayed level, like she could already see past this canyon, through bone and skin, straight into the marrow of every man watching her. The crowd was quieter than expected. The air had shifted. Even drunkards held their breath. The auctioneer coughed, glanced at his sheet. Last one, captured up near San Saba, bit a man's ear clean off. She's got a spirit on her, but you can break that easy enough. We'll start at 7. No one moved. Jonah stepped forward and laid down a silver eagle and 2 buffalo nickels. Sold, the auctioneer barked too quick. The girl didn't flinch, didn't move at all when the chain was handed to Jonah. She just stared. Jonah didn't speak to her. He nodded once, and she followed him into the dusk like a shadow he'd owned all along. They rode out west through scrubland and silence. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't tell her. By the second day, she started tracking their path with her eyes, marking hills and bends. He caught her watching a kestrel once, head tilted like she was memorizing the flight. By the 4th day, she tried to run. He woke to the absence of her warmth by the fire and found the chain looped around a branch, stripped clean and wedged to snap free. Clever, almost worked. He caught her at the creek, bare to the waist, rinsing her wounds and setting her jaw. She didn't plead, didn't beg, just stood naked in the moonlight, half her ribs showing. "You run again," he said, voice raw from sleep. "I won't chase, but you'll die out here." She looked at him then, not like he was a man, like he was a storm cloud she'd decided not to outrun. He gave her his coat, said nothing more. She wore it backward, open at the back, like a war robe. Jonah's ranch was 5 days from the nearest town, a plot of dying land where the wind never slept and the bones of his family lay buried under a tree with no leaves. The house was simple, 2 rooms, 1 locked. He gave her the outer room, the hearth, the cot he'd built for his wife before the fever took her. She didn't touch the cot. Slept curled in the corner with her head on her arms, like a wolf in a foreign den. He watched her eat like a starved thing for 3 days. On the 4th, she sat slower, took time to chew. She started looking at him less like prey, more like question. That was when he asked her name. She said nothing. "Fine," he muttered, "don't talk. You'll talk when you're ready." Still she watched him, every move, every silence. Like she was waiting for him to show the crack in the armor, the part where he turned into the men who had dragged her from her land. Jonah didn't give her that. He gave her work. She learned to sweep, to tend the fire, to salt meat and boil hides. She watched him shoe the horses and clean the rifle, and once, Just once, she mimicked the movement of loading it with invisible hands. He didn't correct her. By the end of the second week, she began talking to the horse, not in words he understood, soft syllables in Comanche. She'd braid its mane at dusk, sing low songs. The horse would not let him near after that, only her. When the first winter snow came, she carved a mark into the wood near the door. A single diagonal slash. Jonah asked, "Is that for the snow?" She didn't answer. Later, he counted the marks. One every time a storm passed. One every time she saw something she meant to remember. There were 11 marks when he opened the locked door. Inside was a map, red-inked with 6 names: Otis Finch, Clay Dobbs, Brother Jarrett, Judge Merton, Sullivan Lee. Then one marked only Captain. He added a 7th, RM, and underlined it. He turned. She stood in the doorway behind him, quiet as smoke. Her eyes moved across the names, slow, deliberate. When they reached the last, her jaw twitched. "You know them?" he asked. She nodded once. He handed her a knife, balanced, carved bone handle. "You helped me kill them," he said, "and the chain, gone for good." She took the blade without hesitation. Her smile was the first thing she'd given him that felt like sunlight. It was a predator's smile, not of joy, but of certainty. Otis Finch ran a smuggling outfit out of an abandoned silver mine 20 miles east of Deadwood Bluff. He was the kind of man who never stopped chewing something, jerky, tobacco, bone, because silence made him hear things he didn't want to remember. Used to ride with the cavalry, then broke bad after a border raid went wrong. Now he traded in whiskey, bullets, and broken lives. Jonah knew the place from before, long ago, back when his brother was still alive and they'd come south to scout land. Otis had been waiting there even then. Same mine. Same stench of sulfur and sin. They rode out at dusk, cutting across ghost trails and old buffalo runs. She didn't speak, but she no longer trailed him like a prisoner. She rode beside him now, close enough that he could hear her breath change when the wind shifted or a hawk cut the sky. She had fashioned a crude sheath for the knife and tied it to her belt with twine. It looked right on her, like it belonged there. When they reached the rim of the basin where the mine sat, Jonah motioned for her to dismount. She slid off her horse without a word. They crawled the last mile on their bellies, the shale biting into their palms, the moon behind clouds. From the ridge, they counted 4 men outside the mine, one on a barrel, drunk with his boots off, another pissing into the dirt, 2 more dicing over a fire. No sign of Otis yet, but Jonah knew he'd be below, where the air was worst and the silver veins long tapped dry. She tapped his shoulder, pointed to the far entrance. Secondary shaft, partly caved in but still passable. She wanted to split the approach. He hesitated, then nodded. They moved like shadows, her low to the ground, light as dry leaves, him broader, slower, but practiced. They entered separate mouths of the mine, the darkness folding around them like burial cloth. Jonah reached the lower chamber first. Otis was there, just as expected, sitting at a makeshift desk, ledger open, pistol near at hand. His beard was grayer than Jonah remembered, but the eyes were the same, snake yellow, darting. Jonah stepped forward. Otis squinted into the dark. "That you, Delvin? Heard you were dead." "Not yet. You come to pay back that debt, huh?" "I kept your secret, Jonah. Never told a soul what we did to those." The girl stepped from the shadows behind Otis, silent as rain. He turned too late. The knife took him in the neck. He gurgled, flailed, reached for the gun, but Jonah kicked it aside. Otis hit the ground hard, clawing at his throat, blood spraying in spurts across the stone. He died staring at her. She didn't blink. They left the body where it fell. She wiped the blade on Otis's coat, then drew a symbol on the stone floor in blood, 3 short slashes and a longer one through the center. Jonah didn't ask what it meant. On the way out, she paused beside a rusted minecart filled with bones. Children, maybe, too small for miners. She set it on fire. They didn't speak the entire ride back, but she leaned her head against the horse's neck once, just briefly, like it had carried her through something no human could. When they returned to the ranch, Jonah crossed off Otis Finch's name. She stared at the map, then pointed to the next, Clay Dobbs. "That one?" he asked. She nodded once. Jonah cracked his knuckles, his bones stiff with the cold. "Then we ride at dawn." The snow was thicker now, but the trail ahead had caught fire. Clay Dobbs ran a gang out of an old mission-turned fortress in the Badlands north of Juniper Wash. The walls were made of stone dragged from the earth by long-dead missionaries, and the gates were covered in the hides of animals and men alike. He called it Redemption Hall, though nothing holy had passed through it in years. He was the kind of man who loved performance, wore a preacher's coat over a gun belt, quoted scripture between beatings, baptized his victims in blood, and called it penance. Jonah had only seen him once, years back, when he'd ridden into town with a child's severed hand in his saddlebag, claiming it was the price of discipline. That hand had belonged to a boy who tried to steal a biscuit. They approached Redemption Hall on foot, tying the horses in a dried-up creek a mile off. Jonah carried a rifle strapped across his back, but it was the girl who walked first. She had smeared ash across her face, camouflaging her features, and bound her braids with leather strips taken from Otis's dead hand. The fortress rose from the earth like a wound that refused to close. Watchmen paced the walls, rifles slung loose, laughing with cracked teeth and bloodshot eyes. There were 24, maybe more, too many for a straight fight, but they weren't here for war. Not yet. Jonah led her through a gully choked with thorn brush, then up the rear slope where the stone had begun to crumble. A blind spot. He'd remembered it from his brother's stories, back when Jarrett rode with Dobbs before breaking away and paying the price. They waited until dark, then they climbed. Inside, Redemption Hall stank of sweat and unwashed sins. Men lounged on crates, dogs sniffed at scraps, and laughter broke like gunshots through the corridors. They moved like wraiths, through storerooms, past chained prisoners, into the heart of the structure. Clay Dobbs sat on a throne of railroad ties in a room lit by oil lamps. His beard was thick, his fingers jeweled, and his eyes wild with the madness of unchecked power. A woman knelt at his feet, dazed, bleeding from the lip. Jonah raised the rifle. The girl stopped him with a hand. She stepped into the light. Dobbs laughed when he saw her. "Well, I'll be. Comanche blood walks upright again. They didn't cut your tongue after all." She said nothing. He rose, slow, dramatic. "You must be the one they keep whisperin' about. The one who painted her face and made the scouts piss themselves." She walked closer, no fear, just gravity. "I remember you now," Dobbs said, voice thick with delight. "You were the one with the knife in your boot. Slashed my man's eye out before we dragged you off the ridge. Thought we broke you, but damn if fire don't stay lit sometimes." She reached her hand behind her back. "Come to finish the dance, huh? I ain't as young as I was, but I got enough left too." The knife struck him in the gut. She moved faster than his brain could catch. He staggered. She drove the blade upward, once, twice. He collapsed to his knees, mouth open in silent scripture. Jonah watched from the shadows, didn't interfere. This was hers. Dobbs gasped, blood pooling in his throat. She whispered something in Comanche and slit his throat clean. The woman at his feet crawled back. Jonah helped her up, gave her his coat, pointed her to the hole they'd entered through. By dawn, the fortress was ablaze. The girl had lit each corner with oil and kindling, slow and purposeful like an offering. The screams came late, panic rising, metal clanging, but they didn't wait. They walked away through the smoke, their shadows long behind them. When they reached the ranch, Jonah struck Clay Dobbs from the list. She didn't rest that night. She sat by the fire, sharpening her knife. Her hands were steady, her eyes distant. Next was brother Jarrett. The name alone turned Jonah cold. He's not like the others, Jonah said quietly. He's family. The girl didn't look up. Then you bury him. She left her knife on the table, its edge gleaming in the firelight. Jonah stared at it long into the night, remembering blood, remembering his brother's voice echoing in the ruins of their childhood. They rode northeast through lands scorched by drought and memory. The soil turned redder as they went, stained by iron or blood or both. Jonah didn't speak much, and when he did it was to the horse, not her. His voice carried guilt now, not silence. Brother Jarrett had left the family ranch 15 years ago after a dispute that ended with a broken jaw and a grave without a headstone. He'd taken to calling himself a man of God shortly after, built a church from pine and promise in a valley where no God had ever answered. Jonah hadn't seen him in 10 years, but the letters still came, strange, filled with warnings and dreams. They crossed a dry riverbed just past Yarrow Pass and came upon a funeral pyre, fresh, still smoldering. 7 bodies, children among them, all wrapped in sackcloth and marked with ash crosses on their chests. The girl knelt, touched one of the bundles gently, her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Jonah knew then what Jarrett's sermons had turned into. The chapel stood in the hollow of a basin surrounded by split-rail fences and hollow-eyed converts. Men and women with shaved heads and hands blistered from sun and labor. They sang as they dug graves, rhythm lost to ritual. No one laughed. No one looked up. Jarrett stood on the chapel steps with a rifle in one hand and a Bible in the other. His beard was white now, eyes sunken but bright. He wore a black coat stitched with symbols, not crosses, strange loops and jagged spirals. His voice carried through the wind like a storm waiting to break. "The fire purifies," he called to the workers. "The flesh remembers, the knife forgets." Jonah stepped forward, still preaching madness. Jarrett's smile cracked wide. Well now, the prodigal rides home. The workers froze. The girl remained at Jonah's side, motionless. Jarrett's eyes found her. "She walks with you, that's bold, real bold, you know what she is." "I know what you are," Jonah said. "I remember the mine. I remember the shackles." Jarrett sighed like disappointment came easy. That wasn't sin, that was survival, same as this. These people, they needed to be emptied before they could be filled. "You took children. They were born wrong, blood mixed with lies. This place burns them clean." The girl stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. Jarrett raised the rifle. Jonah shot first. The bullet hit Jarrett's shoulder, spun him sideways. The Bible dropped. The rifle clattered. Workers scattered. The girl was already moving. She leapt the steps, caught him by the collar as he scrambled to crawl. She didn't use the knife this time. She used her fists. Each strike was a beat from the past, bone breaking on bone, skin splitting against guilt. Jonah let it happen, watched as his brother bled across the chapel stones. When Jarrett could no longer breathe, she stopped. Jonah knelt beside him, reached into his coat, and pulled out a folded paper, the last letter Jarrett had sent. It was blank, just a sheet, soaked in oil and ash. They burned the chapel, left the dead where they lay, no words spoken between them until they crossed the ridge. "You loved him once," she said. "I buried him long before today." When they returned, he crossed the name out slow. 3 left, Judge Merton, Sullivan Lee, Captain. The girl's eyes stayed on the last one. Next was Merton, but her silence bent toward the final name like a compass to true north. Judge Merton presided over the town of Barlow Ridge like a hangman with a gavel. He wore black robes year-round, though the desert heat split the earth and peeled paint from every wall. His courthouse was a converted saloon, the bar still intact behind the bench, and his law was written in blood and bribes. Jonah had been there once, watched a man hanged for stealing a loaf of bread, while the banker who'd beaten a pregnant girl walked free. Merton called it justice by the book, but no one ever saw the book. They rode into town just after noon, sun high and cruel. The girl wore a shawl, face hidden, hair tucked up. Jonah kept his hat brim low and tied his coat closed tight. He carried a folded warrant in his pocket, false, written by a friend long buried but once a real sheriff. It bore enough ink and age to pass as truth. They walked into the courthouse without challenge. Inside, the air smelled of whiskey and dust. Men loitered in corners, armed but lazy. Merton was in session, sitting high, feet propped up, reading from a paper that wasn't even court-related. "Next," he barked. Jonah stepped forward. "Got a delivery." Merton looked up. "Who's asking?" Jonah pulled the false warrant. Marshall out of Claiborne died, left some loose ends. "Thought you'd want to handle this one personally." He handed over the paper. Merton squinted, chuckled. "Delvine thought you died." "Got better." Merton turned to the girl. "And she is part of the package." Merton grinned. "I always liked your taste in trouble." He motioned for the guards. "Take her downstairs. I'll look this over." As they moved, the girl turned slightly, met Jonah's eyes. There was no panic, only readiness. He nodded. The cell was iron, buried beneath the old storage room where the foundation sweated and rats moved like ghosts. Merton followed her down after 5 minutes, alone, armed, arrogant. "You know," he said, "we had your kind through here before. You scream like any other girl once the fire gets high enough." She sat on the cot, hands in her lap, watching, calculating. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, keys still in his hand. "You belong to him?" he asked, nodding upward. She said nothing. "I could buy you from him." She stood slowly. Merton smiled. Then she moved. The blade was sewn into the hem of her shawl, bone-hilted. Jonah had made it himself that morning. She buried it in his thigh, spun behind him as he bellowed, then took his wrist and drove it against the bars. The keys dropped. She kicked them aside. He swung wildly, caught her arm. She bit into his shoulder, deep, vicious, tore skin. He screamed, dropped his pistol. She hit him with it, once, twice, then again. When Jonah arrived, the door was open and Merton was on the floor, choking on teeth. Blood pooled beneath his head. The girl stood over him, breathing steady. Jonah crouched, took the judge's ledger from his pocket, flipped through names and transactions. Found hers. Sold, bought, moved, sold again. He tore the page out, handed it to her. She burned it over the lantern flame. Back upstairs, no one stopped them. Merton's guards were drunk or asleep, and the girl's blood-stained shawl made them avert their eyes. At the edge of town, she turned and spat into the dust. Jonah crossed out the name without speaking. Two left. Sullivan Lee was a whisper, a mover of flesh and steel, broker of nightmares. But it was the last name, the captain, that made her fingers twitch every time she passed the list. He'd commanded the raid that tore her from her people. She hadn't spoken his name aloud, but Jonah had heard it once, years ago, in a camp filled with scorched bodies and crying children. Captain Reese Marin, they'd find him soon. But first came Sullivan Lee, the middleman, the one who tied all the others together like sinew through bone. Sullivan Lee held court in a walled hacienda outside the border, near a crossing point where deals were made beneath the glare of lanterns and suspicion. The place smelled of raw leather and stale cigars, the air thick with unspoken threats. Slaves traded, secrets sold, and Lee sat at the center, lean, hawkish, eyes glinting like obsidian. Jonah and the girl approached by moonlight. No horses, they walked barefoot, silent on the river stones. She carried the map folded against her chest. He held his rifle loose, a promise rather than a weapon. They passed through a side gate left ajar, a mercy or a trap. They moved inward, past guards with roped coils, past laughter morphing into fear as she stepped through the shadows like a living omen. Lee spotted them first. He rose from the table where he counted stacked coins. His smile was courteous, devoid of warmth. Delvin, miss. He paused, scanning the girl. Madeline. Jonah stiffened, the girl froze. She did not answer. Lee motioned for whiskey. A delivery of unusual value. I'd thought you dead. Jonah said nothing. Lee offered a glass to the girl. She stared, fingers curling. He did not flinch. Drink, Lee said. She shook her head. Lee looked at Jonah. I didn't curtain call with the others. I gave her a choice, sold or set free. She chose. Jonah's fingers twitched. Lee rose, palms out. I want to hear it from you, the truth. The girl's jaw clenched. She took a step forward. My name is Naya, she said, voice quiet, measured. I was 6 winters when you sold me. Lee's face flickered. Jonah felt the air shift. Naya pulled the map from her coat and pressed it into Lee's face. Each name pressed into memory again. He seized it, eyes drifting. When he reached the bottom, he faltered. The captain's name. Naya's lips curved, not a smile. Reese Marin. Lee's eyes darkened. He looked to Jonah. You realize what this means. Jonah nodded. Lee set the map on the table. I can't protect him. But I can promise what happens next. He stood, crossed to a locked cabinet, withdrew a lantern and a key, opened a drawer, lifted a heavy ring of iron keys. He handed them to Jonah with a twist. They're his. I'm giving you a head start. Naya snatched them, the metal heavy in her grip. She slipped them into her coat without looking at Lee. Jonah asked, why? Lee lit the lamp. Because I owe you. Because this ends at Marin's camp. And because I don't want your kind in my market. Naya and Jonah slipped away through halls lined with cages. Inside the largest, women sat hollow-eyed. She paused, pressed her hand flat against the bars. Whispered names Jonah didn't know. She moved on. Outside, they walked until the desert opened to them, the river on their left and the border bridge ahead. They paused at dawn. Sullivan Lee's hacienda burned behind them, someone's torch, set like a signal. Naya faced Jonah, the keys heavy at her side. Their breath hung in the cool air, full of anticipation. Last 2, Jonah said. Lee gave us what we need. She tucked the keys beneath her shirt. They mounted the horses waiting nearby. Then we find Marin, Naya said. They rode east, dust swirling, toward the crossing where the captain waited. Captain Reese Marin lived inside a war he never left. Not in uniform now, those days had passed, but in posture, in the way he sat straight-backed at the edge of his fortified camp, overseeing men who carried his old habits like infection. They called themselves private guards. They were bounty hunters and killers. The banner above their tents bore no country, only a red X across a black sun. He stayed mobile, paranoid, moving camp every few days. But Sullivan Lee's keys had come with more than metal. They'd come with a map, etched into the base of the ring, a coded trail of Marin's route through the desert wastes. Jonah read it like scripture. They hunted by moonlight, traveling thin passes and wind-scoured trails. Naya said little now. Her silence had changed. It wasn't the shield it once was. It was a blade being honed. Every mile closer, her eyes darkened with memory, with fire. She'd begun to dress in old war style, Comanche warrior braids, paint made from charcoal and plant ash, cut raw and smeared beneath her cheekbones. Jonah didn't ask where she'd learned to mix it. He understood. Some rituals come back when the bones call them. On the 3rd night, they reached a rise overlooking Marin's camp, 12 tents, 24 men, a steam coach with armor plating. Marin himself visible by the central fire, bareheaded, silver hair catching the sparks. He was eating, laughing, like none of it haunted him. Jonah turned to Naya. We hit from the west. I take the outer guards. No, she said. You stay. He stared at her. You can't go alone. She met his gaze. I didn't survive to let someone else finish it. He saw what lived in her then, older than either of them, older than any law. He nodded. Took out his revolver and handed it to her. She didn't take it. I want him to see me. She moved fast, quiet, down the slope and into the tents like smoke. One by one the guards fell, knives to throats, blood pooling silently. Jonah watched from above, heart pacing like a drum in fog. She moved like wind, like revenge dressed in flesh. When she reached the fire, Marin was alone. She stepped into the light. He looked up. His smile broke slowly. "You," he said, not a question, "still alive." She stood straight, war paint cracked on her skin, eyes unreadable. "I saw your village burn," Marin said. "I led that fire. Your people killed settlers. You remember that." She did not speak. "You were meant to die," he said. "I marked you for the ground." "I remember," she said. "You laughed." He stood, hands out. "You think this changes anything? I built this country. I held it together with blood." "You were nothing but—" She struck him across the face. Hard, he staggered, caught himself, his lips split. She struck again, then kicked him into the firelight. He scrambled, reaching for a blade hidden in his boot. She kicked it away. He laughed through blood. "You'll die for this." She knelt over him, pressed her hands to his chest, held his gaze. "No," she whispered, "you already did." The knife was slow this time. Not rage, justice. He died watching her. At dawn, she walked back up the ridge to Jonah, hands black with ash and blood. He said nothing. Just rose, walked beside her. Together they turned east. The map was gone. There were no more names. But behind them, every shadow they'd passed through had been marked, not with revenge, with warning, that what had been taken would never be forgotten. That one girl, torn from her people, bought for $7, had ended a line of fire with her own 2 hands. And left only silence behind.